right? I'm not interested in the historical aspect of Darwin's theory. I believe that the story that is told by Scripture, and that version of the story, is a much better one. It's actually more inclusive. It has more power. But there's something about natural selection that interestingly exemplifies the symbolic pattern and can help you kind of understand how symbolism functions, and how in fact it doesn't move away from symbolism at all. In fact, it seems to be exemplifying it. A good way of understanding the idea of Darwinism, right, is to kind of understand that there's variation, right, and then there's selection, right? So the world produces variation, differences, idiosyncrasies that are not completely in line with the original identity. And then some of those are selected, right? And then there's a judgment. And the judgment is, I don't know if Darwin would have said it that way, but there's a judgment. You could call it an eschatological judgment, which is the idea that if something survives, if something persists, right, it is judged from afterwards, right? So a good way of thinking about it is, people say, well, eyes aren't foreseeing, evolution doesn't work that way. Evolution just proposes, and then whatever makes people survive more is what persists, and it's only afterwards that we can say that eyes are foreseeing. And it's like, yeah, that's right. And that's called judging. And that's great. It's actually part of the process. It's like meaning can be seen in the process, let's say from above or from verticality. And that is part of ultimately the process of how this happens. And so, you can understand this basic idea that the world produces variation, right? And then the selection of what is selected in the variation is what constitute the perpetuation of that being, what leads to the perpetuation of that being. So selection is vertical, right? Because selection selects towards the continuation of being, right? And then ultimately that leads to things being able to be seen as having purposes, right? Eschatologically, in the end, you can see the purpose of what was happening at the outset, And so this is actually a description of how kind of symbolism functions, is that the world down here is kind of flux, and then there's a selection, right? So it's like underneath here is a bunch of atoms, right? There's a bunch of stuff in here. There's glass, there's whatever, like all the atoms that are part of it, and in those atoms, you can absolutely not see the glass, right? You can't discern the glass in the atoms. You can't discern the glass in the molecules. You can't discern the glass in the parts. You can only discern the glass in the way that it is selected towards its purpose, right? And the purpose is eschatological in the sense that I know that it's a glass because I can drink from it, and I know what it is, and I know how that selection was appropriate because it was selected towards the purpose. Okay. And so this is the idea, is that you can understand even symbolic patterns in that way. You can understand how symbolism developed, you could say, from bottom up in that manner. So think about, for example, a bunch of fairy tales, think about a bunch of stories being told over a very, very long time. And so you have, and I don't even believe this, but it's like, you think of the gross, like vulgar version. It's like, yeah, a bunch of cavemen, sitting in caves, and they're kind of stupid, and they're sitting around a fire, and they tell each other a story. And then some of those stories, people just forget them. They're not particularly interesting, but for some reason, we don't even know why, some of the stories, people pay attention, and they're like, oh, rock, that's interesting. That's an interesting story. And so what happens to that story if people sit around the fire and think, oh, that was an interesting, I don't know why. I'm too stupid. I'm too much of a caveman to know why. I just see that it's an interesting story. So maybe the next day what they do, because it was so interesting, they remember it, And so then when they're sitting around a campfire, they'll try to tell a version of that story. And so maybe they'll change it a little bit. Maybe they'll change some. And then a bunch of people will tell versions that are slightly different one from the other. But the ones that are the best ones, those that are not told right, or those that they change stuff, but it's not interesting, what's going to happen? They'll be forgotten. But then those that are told and that are remembered, they'll be passed on. And then you can do that through iterations. So there's constantly variation being introduced into the story. There's constantly changes, little differences, little changes in intonation, different lengths, different, all kinds of possible variations. And the ones that are the best are remembered and passed on. And you can imagine someone who knows the version and then here's another version of the same story. It's like, oh, this one's way better. Like, now I'm going to tell this one. So now they tell that story. And so just through variation and selection, through attention and memory, and then instantiations of that selection and attention over generations and generations and generations, then you have these amazingly powerful stories that contain the entire pattern of human attention over millennia. And so even if people don't know what they mean, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if people know what the fairy tales mean. It doesn't matter if people know what the myths mean. People always say, like, it's like, oh, did people really know? Did people really know what they were doing? No, who cares? It's like, who cares? All they needed to do was remember and transmit. That's all they needed to do. And if they remembered and transmitted, then that process of refinement was going to continue until today. And so there is a way in which, like, that's why, when you talk about symbolism, we tend to look at the old stories. We tend to look at the ones that have been transmitted over millennia. Why? Because the fact that they have been transmitted for so long and that they have been remembered in this way is almost a guarantee that they contain in them the very pattern of care and of human attention. Okay. And that is what the basic pattern of symbolism is. So the basic idea is that the world manifests itself as hierarchy of care. So you can see how this happened in the iteration that I told you. Right. So this kind of Darwinian process that I mentioned, right, just to understand it, obviously I'm making a huge caricature of it just to make a point, but you can understand how the story of superstition that I mentioned at the outset, how that could happen through this process, how without even knowing, people could develop a tradition that would be completely meaningful and very, very coherent. And it doesn't need anybody to know what it means. It doesn't need anybody to have a deep sense of what's happening. It only needs to be transmitted and repeated and passed on and remembered. And so you can understand that the world is manifested as this hierarchy of care, right? Everything that appears to us as having being in the world needs to be organized in this hierarchy of care. The world is manifested as attention. And so in the same way that the things that we pay attention to, they will structure the meaning of the world, right? The thing that they will give us the hierarchy. It doesn't mean that the things we don't immediately pay attention to don't exist. That doesn't mean that. It just means that what it does is it gives you the order of the world, right? The attention, the care, the fact that we have a hierarchy of attention is what gives us the order of the world. And that order is the pattern of symbolism. It's the order of care in the world. And so that is also true about how facts work, right? And so facts are always embedded in higher identities. Those higher identities are purposes. They aren't just like raw identities. They have to be filtered through the human as a microcosm of the process, of the natural process. And that is how we can kind of see that the world reveals itself in the world. And so that's true of all kinds of things. It's true of images. It's true of stories. And necessarily, the world will manifest itself as a story, right? Because in order for you to be able to pay attention to things, in order for you to be able to remember things, in order for you to be able to tell them to others, you need to have them ordered in a certain way. And that order is not arbitrary. That order is something like Darwin preaching the gospel. That order is based on a hierarchy of things that will lead to the perpetuation of being. And that's happening at every single layer, all the time, constantly. And some of that is unconscious in the sense that there are things that you unconsciously pay attention to. You know, they're just part of how you engage with the world, right? But even though you do it unconsciously, it still reveals itself to you in that proper order. And so now you could say, okay, Jonathan, you're making a big case for this. You're making a big case for how the world reveals itself to you. But what does that look like? Like, what is the pattern? What is the pattern? And so that pattern, the way in which the world reveals itself to you, and this will become clear, obviously, as we kind of look at the pattern itself. This is what we'll be exploring, in the next classes.